that's the fun part about supply chain, is you never forget what you've learned, because it's all important what you've learned. So you don't throw it out the window, but you have to never be comfortable with what you have. You've got to continue to evolve and change. And I think that's where we're headed.
In general, the efforts of retailers over the last year or two to bring resiliency into their supply chains has really placed a premium on carrier selection. Vendors are measured much more closely than ever with regard to on-time and in-full deliveries, and selection of and collaboration with the carriers is just an absolute must.
Hello and welcome to Cargo Shorts, brought to you by Old Dominion Freight Line. I'm your host, Jonathan Betts, and today we're going to talk about navigating supply chain complexities. The pandemic, as we all know, caused a seismic shift in the industry and resulted in systemic changes to traditional supply chain strategies. So, what lessons did we learn, and where have we landed to better meet customer demands? Joining me are two people who experienced firsthand the many supply chain challenges over the past 3 years. First, we have Joe Metzger, former Executive Vice President of Supply Chain Operations at Walmart. He also spent nearly 30 years in consumer product goods supply chain leadership at Kraft Foods and the Kellogg Company. And we are also joined by Greg Plemmons, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Old Dominion Freight Line. Greg has over 2 decades of experience working in LTL and transportation. Joe and Greg, it's so good to have you both with us today.
Good morning.
Great to be with you.
All right, Joe, let's start with you because you've got a lot of experience in consumer products and retail logistics. We mentioned your experience at Walmart, Kellogg Company, Kraft. These are big consumer brands. And when people walk in stores, they expect to see these products on the shelves. So, talk about from a retail perspective, what were the biggest challenges you had to surmount these last few years through the pandemic and then into recovery?
Well, that's probably why I retired in February, because of that question itself. Now, first of all, thanks for having me on this podcast. I was 36 years in total in supply chain, as you mentioned, actually 32 plus years in CPG, Kraft, Kellogg's, and then the last nearly 4 years at Walmart before I retired. And I will tell you, from many of us longtime supply chain folks, there were a number of concerns we had for years in the supply chain, as long before the pandemic. And what we saw in the pandemic is a number of those concerns turned into real breaks and real cracks in the supply chain, and then caused us to have the biggest issue, which is not having product available for the American consumer and consumers around the world. And let me tell you kind of a few, what I think of the core root causes, and then I'll mention a bit on kind of some of the lessons learned. I think one of the things that many of us worked on for years was getting a just-in-time demand and supply. And what that means is there's just not a lot of inventory for those unexpected events. And if you think about all the way, from the supplier all the way to the shelf or delivery to home, everything was just in time. And we worked really hard to build supply chains end-to-end that could handle that. Well, what happened was when that demand spiked in the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of inventory to help us get through it. And so that was a key part of it. I think the second thing, as I think about it, Jonathan, is the supply chain got a lot longer over the last 10 or 15 years. We started sourcing a lot more product from Asia, general merchandise, raw materials, components. So now, instead of a supply chain that's a couple of weeks, it's a supply chain that's months. And then as you saw this demand spike, not a lot of inventory. It takes a long time to get this stuff across the ocean. And then the ports were backed up, not enough ships, et cetera, et cetera. That created a significant issue. And so the longer supply chain, I think, was a key root cause. I think a third piece that I would say, and I'm a longtime manufacturer, we took a lot of manufacturing capacity out the last 10 years. We didn't want the fixed cost. We wanted to be able to run our factories at the highest level of capacity and utilization. So once again, you get a demand spike, there isn't a lot of excess firepower and capacity. And then the last thing, and I think Greg could talk probably even more articulately about this than I, there's consolidation in transportation, ships, rails, trucks. And so you put that all together, we were wound tight, and then the high demand supply issues, and obviously a lot of the factories and a lot of the transportation companies had many associates out with COVID, so there was not enough labor. And you put that all together, and that's why we saw outages for the American consumer.
And I was going to ask you, I mean, are these issues still there, or do you think that changes now have been made and lessons learned?
Well, I think many of the lessons learned are going in place. I do worry a little bit, though, because demand has softened, that we may fall right back into where we were before the pandemic. But I do think there's two or three things that I would say we've learned and we're getting better at. First of all, the crux of all of it is you need to know how much you need to produce. And so that demand signal, which has always been that we've been chasing getting the right demand signal for the day, the week, the month, the quarter, the year, the next 3 years. We've got to this is where I love the power of machine learning and AI and analytics and data. We need to let the power of the computing come together so we have truly know what we need to sell and make over the next few years. And I think that if we can trust that number, then we can plan so much better for our end-to-end supply chains. How much do we need to procure? How much do we need to make? How much do we need to inventory? And I actually think that's the biggest lesson learned, and the hope I see a lot of the industry focused on. The other part I would say is you can't look at your supply chain in vertical silos. You got to, not just transportation, not just distribution, not just manufacturing. You've got to look at this thing from supplier all the way to the shelf and make sure you've got the right contingency plans, the right backup plans. So if there is a crunch in there, you can handle it end to end. So those are just a few thoughts that I see of lessons learned. And I would say, in answer to your question, I think we're working on it. I still think we've got more to do.
Yeah, more work to do. And Greg, we've talked about this, the work that's left to do. I mean, talk about some of the supply chain challenges you've seen over the last few years with Old Dominion, and what kind of changes the company has made to become more resilient and collaborative.
Yeah, I think Joe makes some great points there. And you know, the key going forward is collaboration across the entire supply chain between shippers, receivers, and their carriers, ocean carriers, truckers, all that sort of thing. The sharing of data and collaboration across there is an area where we have to continue to focus. I think in general, the efforts of retailers over the last year or two to bring resiliency into their supply chains has really placed a premium on carrier selection. Vendors are measured much more closely than ever with regard to on-time and in-full deliveries. And since carriers are really just an extension of those vendors, selection of and collaboration with the carriers is just an absolute must. And so, we've as an industry, and we here at Old Dominion have reacted with beefing up our what we call MABD services, must arrive by date services, very popular amongst our customer base. We've instituted a chargeback research tool to help vendors in many cases dispute the chargebacks and penalties that they've been assessed with. And so we reacted to it, and it's been a real growth area.
Joe, as you kind of alluded to, we're still not completely back to normal here. We do hear these reports of high levels of retail inventories, and yet for some goods, you can see it. You walk into the store, they're out of stock, which I think a lot of people are still having a hard time understanding since we're so far away from the pandemic and what we thought were these supply chain logistical issues. So, drawing on your experience here, can you tell us a little bit about why we're seeing this, and how can manufacturers work with retailers to try to ease this problem?
Well, things are getting better. So the amount of shortages are getting less and less. I would tell you the areas where there are still gaps are generally due to, back to my earlier point, those long supply chains where things got backed up so dramatically that they're still recovering literally 12, 18 months later. And I think demand is softening now. So I think you'll see the last parts recovered here over the next year. But I think the answer, and Greg alluded to it, I think the answer that we all have to continue to work on, and I've spent my whole career trying to progress this, is we have to plan across industry so much better. And there's always been a hesitancy to do that. The shippers, the manufacturers, the retailers. But I really believe that ultimately we have to plan at a much more transparent, granular, detailed level so that we can truly and have the American consumer front and center so that we can ensure we have product. And I actually think it would improve the cost structure for everyone if we did that well. So I believe, and we need to put the power of AI and the power of machine learning and the power of our computing power, which I said earlier, to give us confidence in that demand so that we can plan for appropriately. And I think that's what all legs of the economic chain need to do, from supplier to manufacturer to retailer to shipper.
I love that you're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning here when it comes to transportation and logistics. I mean, do you see a future there?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, these are fancy terms, but we've been working on data and analytics for 10, 15 years. I think from my simple mind, what's occurred the last year or two is now the computing power, the power of taking all that math where people don't have to touch it and say, oh, I don't think that number's right, I'm going to add 15%, or, we need to now, really let the computers put all that data together and go from there. So think about that. If you can get that data from every store and every sale, and that can come together, and then it can apply, here's the trends we're seeing on an individual item or SKU, aggregate that all together for a manufacturer or a supplier. I mean, that's pretty powerful. And that used to be pie in the sky, but I think we're getting closer and closer.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a new world is approaching here. Greg, I know this is something you've talked about a lot about transparency, the need for a digital transformation when it comes to logistics. But I also kind of want to get your thoughts on just how would you describe the current state of retail shipping right now, especially since, we have to consider the Amazon model and how that's affected shipping.
Sure. I agree with a lot of the points that Joe's made to this point. Retail shipping, from our perspective, seems to have stabilized a great deal. 21 and 22 were challenging because retailers were catching up from the backlogs that resulted from the pandemic, and order and receiving cycles were out of sync. There were staffing issues, port delays, and all the things that we've talked about in the past. But here at OD and really throughout the industry, we were forced in many cases to institute embargoes, even for certain retailers at certain DCs, because they simply, were unable to receive the cargo that we had for them. And we don't have the extra capacity in either trailers or dock space to store dozens of shipments waiting for a DC to catch up. But those issues seem to have dissipated to a large degree so far this year, and I suspect that trend will continue.
But like with the Amazon model, Greg, and the changing landscape, what are you seeing and hearing from your customers? Do you feel like expectations are different now than they were even just a couple of years ago?
Well, certainly, speaking from personal experience, seems like we have at least one package on the front doorstep about every day at my house. And so the expectation now is, you order it one day and receive it the next, or even in some cases receive it, that same afternoon or evening. And so the expectations are much greater. I think that's all driven by the trends we've seen over the last couple of years. Retailers in general continue to institute additional measures to incentivize their vendors to have shipments there, not early, not late, but exactly on time and complete and in perfect condition. So the landscape has changed for sure. We've, I think, reacted to it here at Old Dominion. I think the industry has reacted and will continue to do so as the situation evolves.
Talking about some of those reactions, Joe, I know you've seen the introduction of initiatives such as customer scorecards based on an on-time and in-full requirement. So has that worked? Is it helping drive efficiency and higher levels of customer satisfaction with the shopping experience?
First of all, I'll give you the lens of as a supplier to the retailers at my Kraft and Kellogg's days. Those scorecards were brutal because it pointed out all of the deficiencies, right, that I may have had in my supply chain. And I will tell you, when those scorecards came out a number of years ago, it made us a better supply chain. We truly got into whether it was a manufacturing capacity issue, whether it was inventory control levels. It sharpened at least my lens much more on the customer, and it made us better. And I think as painful as it was the right thing. Then you go over to the retailer side. As I work for Walmart, I mean, it's a simple thing. Those scorecards are only there so we have product for the customer. It's just all about when that customer comes into the store or orders online, we just need that product available. And the scorecards are absolutely helping to have more in stock and availability for the customer. And so I think it's a good thing.
I mean, Greg, what do you think? This is something I've heard you talk about, just this, you're open to the feedback. You want this communication. You want this two-way communication. So your thoughts on that?
No, I think I agree with Joe. The whole scorecard and the penalties associated with early or late deliveries, all that has strengthened the supply chain overall. It's made us here at Old Dominion a better carrier, and I think the industry as well. It highlights some deficiencies in the supply chain, and I think vendors in general have reacted. And this is a point that I made earlier. I think they've reacted by putting more thought into the carrier selection initially, and then into the sharing of data so that everyone can plan and execute perfectly. You really have to be almost perfect with the way that these scorecards and the associated penalties are set up today.
So, Greg, where do you see all of this going? What does the future look like when it comes to the retail environment? And what does it mean for retail shipping? Is there a race for digital enablement and automation? And what changes do you see coming down the line?
I think we're seeing more and more retailers diversifying their ecosystems by offering adjacent services and products. Joe could probably speak more to this, but I believe Walmart offers financial services, for example, Amazon exploring healthcare services, even some retailers offering business and logistics consulting and advice, that sort of thing. So we're seeing a diversification there of their ecosystems, and I think we're beginning to see, and this is something Joe did touch on earlier, and that's the leading retailers are using analytics and data to collaborate with their vendors to improve the outcomes for themselves as well as their vendors. And really the point around AI, machine learning, the computing power associated with all of that will, I think, just only accelerate that trend.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, we're talking about trends, expectations, that the expectations are rising, the demands are rising. People are expecting everything to arrive now. The window of delivery is closing. So how do you balance those inventory demands?
That's a great question. Even this morning, we have Walmart Plus, so we have our groceries delivered to our home. And even this morning, before I was doing this podcast, I thought of a couple things I wanted to add for a 2:00 delivery this afternoon. And I just went online and added those items. So think about that to your question, then back to the supply chain. Here's something going to be delivered to a home, right? And 5 hours from now, and there's still items being added that have to be taken into account. And so as you think about and Greg made the correct point as well, we have to have that inventory so accurate. And so if you want same day delivery, next day delivery, 2-day delivery, as well as traditional shopping from the shelf, and many, folks are picking up across at the grocery stores. So you got pickup, you got delivery growing dramatically, and you've got traditional on shelf. So now the inventory has to be so much more tightly controlled. And, I'm kind of a broken record on tracking inventory placement, knowing exactly where it needs to be. It isn't just the truck shows up at the store overnight and then you load the shelves. That's not going to cut it anymore. You have to have much tighter visibility of inventory all the way through to kind of to a case level. I think the second piece, and Greg talked about this too, transportation now has to be so much more precise than it's ever been. There used to be big windows when that truck could go pick up at a supplier, or big windows of time where that truck could deliver to a store. No, it has to be precise because we need that inventory exactly at the right spot at the right time, specifically at a store, because that product has to go on the shelf. It may be picked immediately for delivery, for pickup. And so the precision and then transportation exact delivery is such a critical factor. And I think Greg's made the point twice. That's become, you talk about the scorecard. My view has always been service is more important than anything as it comes to transportation. And now the providers that can be really close to perfect in their delivery is going to be great. Of course, the distribution centers have to be on time, but transportation has to be exact. And I think those are all the things as we tighten everything up. That's what it's going to take care of the American consumer.
But Joe, when you talk about these shrinking windows and tightening everything up, are you talking about efficiencies in the current system, or do you think that the supply chain system as it stands needs to be completely reimagined?
I don't know if it's reimagined, but it's a continued change, update,
evolution,
modification, evolution, and I think that's the fun part about supply chain is you never forget what you've learned because it's all important what you've learned. So you don't throw it out the window, but you have to never be comfortable with what you have. You've got to continue to evolve and change. And I think that's where we're headed.
So Greg, as the system evolves and changes, how do carriers fit into this equation? What is needed to sustain or improve this new model?
Yeah, first I'll just tag on to something, a point Joe made, and that is, we used to have as a carrier at most retailers, we had a window of 2-3 days even that we could, as long as we delivered, in that window, we were okay. Those days are long gone, and it is precision. It's to the hour, to the minute, and again, that's forced us to be a better carrier and to be a better partner with our customers. Carriers at the end of the day are just a delivering arm for the shipper, right? I mean, our driver represents the shipper when they arrive at a retailer's DC or at any consignee. So it's important not only that the shipment is on time and in great condition, but that driver must be courteous and professional. Tractor and the trailer must be clean and well maintained. I mean, in short, the delivery has to be darn near perfect, and anything less is going to cause penalties, both monetary and otherwise. So that's an area of focus for us certainly over the last few years. It's been a real growth area, to be honest, for us because we pride ourselves on that precision. I will mention a trend that we're seeing lately, and this seems to have picked up steam, and that's some retailers giving us and LTL carriers in general appointments that are evening, middle of the night, weekends, and so forth. And in some cases, that's going to cause a carrier to have to bring a driver in, on a weekend or a holiday, just deliver a couple skids or a few shipments, and that's really costly, to be honest. And when there was a point in time where we would simply request a different appointment, but that's tracked and penalized by retailers too. And so those deliveries are really costly for the carrier. And, hopefully, we'll certainly adjust to it. We'll continue to see the retailers able to staff up and receive in a more consistent basis. But in the meantime, those extra costs are going to be passed along to payer the freight charges. And so that is driving some additional cost into the supply chain.
Well, as you both have mentioned, in this changing landscape, service matters now more than ever. I can't repeat that enough, it seems. Joe, Greg, great conversation. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's great.
So much to consider when it comes to meeting demand in the shipping and logistics environment. You both have provided some pretty good insights. We really appreciate it on how we are reimagining the supply chain ecosystem. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our full Cargo Shorts podcast series. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, SoundCloud, and Google Podcast. Visit the OD Outlook section of the Old Dominion Freight Line website at odfl.com, where you can find additional information and materials on this topic. Thanks for listening.